Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to the VESTA Analytics webinar. My name is Flynn, and I'm going to be your host today. Before we turn it over to your presenters, Ron and Kim, and Ron, would you turn the slides so everybody can see your pictures and know who you are? Thank you. I just wanted to say a few words about the series that we have been running on VESTA Analytics since April. This is the last in the series, and we have had such great participation in each session, so I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us. Our theme throughout the session has been how to make your data work for you so that you can take a load off. And what you're going to hear today is really a home run in bringing that theme to light. What Kim and Ron are going to do is take you through one of the newer components in the system, which is the VESTA Analytics Dashboard. This is an additional fee-based module, and you're going to see how it offers you an extremely easy way to analyze your data from different perspectives. Now, why is this so important? The reason is because when you see firsthand exactly how you can make your data give you the information you need, you begin to realize just how powerful data can be in helping you be more productive and, as a result, more effective in serving your community. So sit back, take a load off, leave the driving to us, and we are so glad you are all here. We're going to take your questions at the end, so please save them up. Give us lots of good, hard questions. We love good, hard questions. Ron and Kim, over to you.
Thanks, Flynn. So today, as Flynn mentioned, we'll go through this overview for the dashboard module. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, as Flynn mentioned, this is our 5th VESTA Analytics webinar of the year. In this session, we'll continue to discuss how rich the capabilities are within VESTA Analytics using this dashboard module. This module is a fee-based module, so as we go through this, if you're interested, at the very end, I will provide you information on how you can get with your regional sales account manager for more information on this module. There's a lot behind VESTA Analytics Dashboard. So we're going to break it down and start with a general overview of data analytics and some of the concepts and terms that we use today within VESTA Analytics Dashboard. We will then cover the 3 pre-built dashboards as well as our dashboard workbench. At the end, we'll conclude with walking you through a couple of scenarios, as we've done in the past webinars with me playing the role of a PSAP manager and looking for assistance in creating a dashboard. First, we'll show off for showing the level of service. Again, this is just some of the data analysis that can be done using this VESTA Analytics Dashboard module. As within our last webinar, we'll take your questions at the end of the session. So please, as you get questions, go ahead and use the chat mode and type those in so that you don't forget your questions at the end. So let's go ahead and get started with the dashboard overview. VESTA Analytics offers a full range of features available for different data consumers. So we offer from static to pre-built reports for quick reporting. We also provide ways to create configurable and custom reports for those looking to analyze, group, and compare data, as well as ad hoc reports where you can create your own reports. We also provide ways to utilize an ad hoc data analysis through our dashboard module, where you can perform analysis and discovery on data and drill down into the root cause of any negative operational exceptions. This flexibility is for those administrators who want to dive deeper into their data and want to understand what their data is telling them. So now we'll go over some terms that we'll be using throughout this presentation and webinar. The first is business intelligence, which we also refer to as BI. BI is a wide category of applications and technologies for gathering, storing, analyzing, and providing access to data to help enterprise users make better business decisions. The BI application includes activities of decision support systems, query and reporting, online analytical processing, also known as OLAP, and statistical analysis. OLAP, which is the online analytical processing, is a class of applications to quickly answer multidimensional analytical queries. And lastly, the OLAP cube. That is a multiple dimensional set of data used for dynamic analysis. So you may hear Ron throughout this webinar use terms such as the dashboard offers a way of looking at the data from a different perspective using different data structures behind the scenes. So in this picture, we depict how data comes in from our VESTA 911 system. So first, it gets in from the VESTA 911 system, and it sends the data directly to the VESTA Analytics through a data adapter, also known as the data processor. From there, we process the data into our database. We also refer to that database as a PIDB database, which utilizes SQL Server. This holds all of our detailed transactional data. From there, we then transform the data into a multidimensional structure in a cube that allows you to analyze and drill through large amounts of data. The cube drives the dashboard because it's stored for analysis. Lastly, we'll show you how this will represent to our users through our dashboard module. This next slide will show you an example of a multidimensional model and why it helps analyze data so much. For example, if I want to know the total call count for calls answered with a ring event where the ring duration lasted between 1 and 10 seconds for quarter 4, this is how it would be done. The multidimensional structure allows me to slice the data across the call type dimension for answered calls. It then looks across the ring time range dimension for calls answered between 1 and 10 seconds. Lastly, it looks across the calendar for Q4 and tells me the one aggregated number that I need to know. You can now easily look at the data. It does this without having to recount all the millions of individual data points and aggregates at these various levels. So you can drill down and drill across these areas to quickly analyze your data. A couple more terms we'll be using through the presentation is, the first one is measure. We use measure. This represents factual data related to a specific item. Examples of this include call count, ring duration, and average queue time. The dimension identifies and categorizes groups and measures. Examples of this include agents, call category, zip codes, trunk lines, class of service, and time. Next, we have hierarchy. Hierarchy is the logical structure that groups dimension members for the purpose of aggregating the data. Examples of this include many. One is calendar, whether it's year, quarterly, monthly, weekly, or daily. The next one is call classification, category, call origin, service, type, and subtype. And then we have an example of agent groups, which would include all agents, skill set, call taker, or dispatcher. Lastly, we have members. Members are the lowest level in a hierarchy. Examples of that include agent name, console, and ESN. So now I'm going to pass this over to Ron and let him walk you through some of the specifics that make up our VESTA Analytics Dashboard. Ron, over to you.
Thanks, Kim. Kim kind of gave a really good overview of some of the terms that we use, and I'm going to kind of now walk us through a little bit of the lay of the land for our dashboard module. Some of the things we'll be looking at is accessing what we call briefing books. There's a public briefing book and a private briefing book, and this is just kind of where we store our dashboard views. We'll talk about the slicing, slicer and slicing, which is kind of where we house all those dimensionals. It gives you a different perspective of looking at data. We'll look at pivoting, which is a way of kind of taking your cross-tabular data and switching that around and rotating that. We can also nest different dimensions to give you a more granular view or a hierarchical view as well. We'll touch on selecting and sorting options, how you can select a column and hide that member or show only that member, where you can drag and drop various objects onto your data table layout in your dashboard and be able to manipulate the data that you're looking at. We'll also look at quick ways to filter data out, and one of the things I like is exceptions. We'll be able to add visual exceptions that pop out on a grid, so that you might be looking at vast amounts of data, and this data may be nested several layers deep, but you might not easily pick it up without some visual eye indicators. So we'll show how we can add exceptions and how that adds value to helping you find the data. We'll look at some formulas, how you can quickly create formulas that might not readily be available, or that they may be customized to your environment. So you can easily create a formula or an additional data value that you might want to use for your dashboards. And then there's even a little piece in there where we have a report mode, where you can do all this manipulation. You can create a view of data and charts that you like, and then you can easily switch that into report mode and send that off as a PDF document. So this is one example, and we'll kind of get started here. This is kind of a nice layout that talks about the dashboard module. And a few things that I want to highlight is a title bar. So you'll see this title bar called Call Category over Measures and Call Service. And that title of your dashboard essentially changes based on the data that you're analyzing. So this is representing call category, which is the 3 columns I have across the top of my data table down below. The measures is the numerical values that I'm counting. So right now I'm counting a call count, and it's also looking at class of service, because I've nested, or not class of service, call service. I've nested the call service in here as well. So this is telling me that I'm kind of looking at call categories or a measure of call count across call services. This is also represented down in the legend as well. You can see that the cube that you're looking at, the columns are listed as call category, your rows are measured with call service nested next to it, and that you're actually counting a measure of call count. So that's the title bar that goes across the top. We also have a toolbar, and we're going to cover this toolbar in a little while, but this allows you to really control a lot of what you're seeing and doing here with the grids and the charts throughout the dashboard, throughout the time that you're working in the dashboard. We also have private books, briefing books, public and private. The difference is that our public briefing book is one that we've created as part of the Airbus deliverable, and this drives a lot of the 3 predefined dashboards that we're going to talk about in a little bit. It is locked down, so you're not going to be really saving or changing this. We like to be able to give you this as a starting point. What's nice about it is you can select any one of these dashboards we've provided and then save it with your own name down in your private briefing book. And this is private for each individual user. For example, I'm logged in as the administrator. So I have an administrative briefing book, and I can create a number of folders and views. And I can, in this example, you can see I've taken a call perspective by month, by week, and I can manipulate that data and save it off as a call perspective by weekday or a call perspective by year. That way I don't have to really go back later and manipulate the data. I can just double click and get these views to pop up anytime I want. The slicers panel also gives you the way of dragging and dropping different dimensional groupings. So for example, I'm looking at call service here. I could easily replace call service with consoles and list call count by console because that's just a different way I want to look at my data. The legend I kind of briefly talked about, you can have that shown or not. One of the things you'll see is you have these little pins and X's on each one of these panels. You can easily pin that or unpin it, and it'll slide over to the left. Or I can exit out and have it go away altogether. But you can always bring that back real easily by selecting this little wrench on the toolbar up on top, and it'll bring everything back. It'll give you the options to bring which panels you want to come back for display. Obviously, we have a chart and we have a grid. These can be on the top or bottom, and I'll show you later how you can place those however you want. You don't even have to show them both. You could just show a grid if you're more comfortable working with a grid. We could do that as well too. So as I mentioned, the briefing books, typically we'll hide that briefing book once you start getting a a library in your own private folders. So let's go ahead and talk about this toolbar up on top first, just to get you familiar with the toolbar inside our analytics dashboard. Like I mentioned, there's that little wrench that allows you to hide or show those various panels. We also have a grid chart icon on that toolbar that lets you show the charts or above your cross-tabular data. You could look at just the cross-tab or just a chart. There's another properties chart icon on the toolbar that lets you manipulate the chart. So you can have bar charts, line charts, pie charts. You can rotate the chart. You can include a legend on the chart or not. You can include to show these data labels here for each item on the chart if you wanted to. That gives you that flexibility. There is a little report mode, so like I said, I'll show you that later. It can take your dashboard and quickly launch you into a WYSIWYG report environment. There's the option to undo, so if I'm dragging and dropping data and I did it wrong, or if I selected data and all my data disappeared because I selected a value that didn't really apply, I can easily hit undo, and I can do that multiple times until I get back to the point where I was last comfortable. We're allowed to, the toolbar also gives you an option to save a bookmark to this. You can save the data that's in that tabular data to an Excel file. You can create the whole, you can take the whole workboard, dashboard I should say, and convert that into a PDF after you're done doing all the work that you wanted to do. And then if you have email enabled, you could also send that view, which will send the dashboard link to another individual. We also have printing options. Obviously, you can print preview, print it, just like anything else inside analytics when it comes to reporting. So those are kind of the lay of the land for our dashboard module. I'll kind of drive down into a little more of these in some detail to get you a little more comfortable with it. So when we talk about those slicers, you saw a panel for slicers, and they're really dimensions or ways to group data. We also have measures that are those numerical points Kim was talking about that are prevalent throughout the dashboard application. I can easily look at this table and I'm seeing numerical values, which are measures that we're counting. Some of these measures are call counts per hour. Some are averages. Some can be straight numbers just by call count. Some can be a percentage factor or a formula that we decide to create using our own mathematical or logical expressions. So those are where those measures show up. Your slicers are, again, we're slicing by an agent. So I'm looking at all my data across my agents. So that's my focus, is I've looked at a dimensional view of my agents and how they're performing with respect to those numbers. Now, just because I have a few of those measures displayed doesn't mean those are the only ones that are available. I can immediately double click on this measure dimension, which is also a way of grouping things, and see all of these measures that are available. And I can move them back or forth, left and right, to decide if I want them displayed on my grid. I might only want a few. I might not be interested in internal or none or outgoing, and I can take those off. We can also manipulate those on the grid itself, and I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. We can search for things if we don't see it in the list. We could easily search for numerical value that we might already be providing. And these values are essentially all the data points that we have inside our system. We have a lot of that raw data that Kim showed you in the beginning, but then we calculate that and process it into this multidimensional structures where we'll create counts and durations and max and mins, and all that data then becomes aggregated so that you can use the dashboard to quickly get this data to where I don't have to count through millions and millions of records and figure out what an average was over those 6 million records. It's already been done for you, and we've already stored it, processed it, and made it available for the dashboard. So again, those slices I was talking about, one thing I want to talk about is there's sometimes they're simple groups and they're hierarchical groups. For example, my standard calendar is going to let you look at data across all the calendar for all the calls that are in your system. So what we've done is we've created a hierarchy so you could drill down from your year to your quarters to your month down to your days. Some of these dimensions are structured like that. So you could put it out on your table and say, I'm counting everything by year, or I want to look at all my emergency calls or all my abandoned calls, per year. And then I can drill down through that. So if I use a dimension that's hierarchical, it allows me to do that. And there's different levels and members within there. Some of the slicers only have individual members in them. So if I pulled up class of service, I might be showing my data for all these classes of service, or I could use it just to select an individual class of service if I was only focused on one or a few of those. Same thing with weekday. Weekday is not hierarchical, similar to like day, where the day would be listed, a calendar day would be listed in your calendar one. The weekday is just a standard set of weekdays that would group all your data based on a day of a week. So I could easily select anything from a level in a hierarchical dimension, or I could select an individual member in one of these other standard dimensions. So again, we talked about the grid and the chart. These can be switched around on the top or the bottom. In this example, you see that there's a chart below the grid, which is real easy. One of the things that I like to show is that, again, in that toolbar is simply selecting a button on the top and deciding where you want that chart to be displayed, or if you only want to see cross-tabular. And again, if I'm in my chart, I can also decide what type of chart I want. There's things you can do, the user can do, to manipulate how the data is displayed or how you're even searching for data. For example, I might have a table here where I'm only focused on abandoned calls, but I have all these other columns on there, and I've created some filtering by, you see this little funnel icon, and it's sorted with a little down arrow. But I just want my abandoned calls. I can easily select the abandoned calls and right-click, and I get a menu that says hide my abandoned calls. Or I could do the same thing and just say, well, I actually only want to see my abandoned calls, so I'm going to select it and say select my highlighted members. And essentially it hides all the other columns that are there, and you could easily come back and go to the hide member or remove a sort or remove hidden members, and it'll show them back to you. So it gives you a lot of the flexibility. I can also right-click and I can add a subtotal if I wanted to. I could sort where I only want to see my class of service for BUSN, or I could just hide those members. I can rotate my charts by selecting the chart and decide how I want to do that. Even larger, not just the components of a grid and a chart, but the entire dashboard application, there's a properties icon up here on your toolbar that lets you open up a properties dialog. And from here, you could do something as simple as changing the color of your charts. So right now I have a couple series in my chart, and it's kind of a teal and a green, right? My call center might be focused on colors. We like to see things in reds and oranges and colors of that sort. So I could easily edit the colors on this series and change that. I could even change the skin and go more along the lines of a desert skin, or if the fonts are hard to read, I can change various fonts to work out to whatever is more specific to my needs. So those are some of the basic things that you know, we kind of get around where you're not having to hunt for things. We like to make them right-click. It easily pops up. You have these context menus, and it's right at your fingertips. So another nice thing we have is on these grids, or these cross-tabular data, is, again, manipulating that data on the fly. So if I wanted to create something that wasn't available, right, I can easily pick a couple of these cells and add a formula. I could pick one cell, or I could pick multiple cells and create these formulas. And you get a range of mathematical options. You can go to advanced and see all kinds of other options where you can actually enter your own percentage. If you're adding a couple values together and dividing it by the parent value and then using that as a percentage of against the grand total, you could do that as well. So we give you that flexibility to go ahead and create values that might be relevant to your operations. So I could easily select a couple values and create a formula, and when you do, you'll see that you have this little formula symbol up here. And that tells you that these are formulas that you've created, and you can easily go in and edit those formulas if you think either you've created it incorrectly or if you want to manipulate it later on time. It tells you what you've done. So, for example, this total calls was essentially selecting all the call ranges and then just summing that up for total calls. And I could select two of these, you know, the 0 to 10 seconds and 11 to 20 seconds, and add those two up for 0 to 20. You can create any numerical combination that you want and have that formula added to your grid. And you can use it to add it. You could use it then for further calculations, which I'll show you in a little bit. And you can even remove it and hide it as well. Once you have these two, there's the ability to evaluate them. So once I create a formula, and we're in this where I created a ratio of one value compared to another, You can evaluate it. You can check to make sure that that's the data you want. You can pick your format, and then you can just essentially say, okay. So once you start adding formulas, you're seeing that you're building out your dashboard. All right, I was looking at a category of calls, which was just my emergency calls, and I'm looking at that from a dimensional perspective of over a calendar year and through quarters. And this is great. I start getting a table full of data. And if you're like me, you start looking at Excel spreadsheets or large amounts of data, or you've got a grid in front of you, and it looks great, but I'm not seeing anything when you start looking at mass amounts of data. So what we like to offer is these exceptions. And I think you'll find that some people like them, some people don't. You can add them at various levels. They can be progressive, where your colors will change, conditional formatting, you can add symbols. But I don't, I need to add something to this for me just to find out where I might have issues. Because I'm looking at this table and I just don't see anything. I don't see the fact that, my answer time in Q1 for calls less than 10 seconds was below my 90%. It just doesn't stand out. And when you're looking at 8s and 9s, it just doesn't pop to me. So what I'd like to do is be able to go ahead and add an exception to call it out. So I can right-click on my grid, go to exceptions, say I want to edit an exception. And since I don't have any, it'll let me add one right off the bat. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give it a name, say less than 90%. I'm going to select a color for red. I'm going to click the drop down, change my fonts to bold. I'm going to apply it to the entire cross-tabular data set. And I want this exception to show up when my call count is less than 90%, because that's the measure that I'm currently using. And I want anything that's less than 90% to show up. And then once I've created that, I can say, okay, and now that cell pops up. And now I can see, oh, okay, that's a lot easier for me to see if there's any issues. The nice thing is, since I applied it to the entire crosstab, I can easily come over to my quarter 1 in 2016, click on the plus symbol and expand that, and that exception applies through all of the hierarchical measures. So it's a nice way to be able to track that as you start changing your data. If I took out, the year and I replaced it with a console or with an agent, that value is still going to apply to this data. So the dashboard, some people are like, well, I don't see dashboard in my application, and, where is it? Well, like Kim mentioned, it's part of an add-on module we have. So if you have a dashboard license with your analytics product, and it's on a standard hosted or enterprise edition, where our dashboard is not offered in our analytics lite, but if you're in a standard hosted or enterprise edition and you purchase that dashboard license, then we'll enable the dashboard menu. And that menu would then be available anywhere in the application you'd see it, and you can just select on that dashboard menu, and you'll be presented with some other menu options. Some of those menu options I'll show you right now is we've decided to provide 3 of the default dashboards, and some of these have a few more enhancements or a few more features that the Workbench doesn't, and we'll kind of elaborate on each one of those. But when you hit the drop down, you can select, for example, the Agent Performance Overview dashboard. And what that does is it brings you a dashboard similar to what we were showing you prior, but our predefined, our pre-built dashboards all have what we call these key performance indicators. It's an additional panel that has these gauges that kind of tell you, similar to when we did the exceptions, of how everything is performing. So with respect to that data, so I'm looking at agent performance data, and it's broken down by agents, and we're looking at average calls answered per hour, their outgoing calls per hour, the percent of time that they're logged in, and these key performance indicators will tell you a few different things with respect to that data. For example, the percent logged in, right? So it's looking at that data over there that was on that grid, and we'll give you a title for each one of these, whether it's emergency calls per hour or percent logged in, and you can look at that title and see, well, I had a goal and I had a value, and obviously my value is high, so I'm in a green range. It kind of shows you the goal as a lollipop icon. It kind of tells you how you're doing with respect to the goal, and then it also kind of has this trend indicator. And the data that we're looking at is over a certain period of time. The trend indicators look at that same amount of data for a similar previous period. So if I was looking at data for today, then the trend indicator looks at that same amount of data yesterday and tells you how you're doing today compared to yesterday. So the percent logged in this example might be lower than it was yesterday, or today is lower than yesterday, whereas my emergency calls per hour might be higher than it was yesterday. The various gauges can show you if you're in a range. This one's slightly below range because it's yellow. This one's, significantly below the range because we're in the red, and we might want to look at our agent efficiency today. So, those are those KPIs that are listed in some of the defaults, and we have 3 of those, one for agent performance and a call center overview and a daily overview. But essentially, each one provides a certain look for you that we've just kind of started thinking, these are some of the things we've heard from our customers that they'd like to know right out of the gate. And we like to call these kind of starting points. We've provided it for you out of the gate with a product, but it's not where your analysis ends. You can easily work with these and continue to do analysis on them. And then what I'll do is I'll show you in the workbench area, you can save these off and use them as starting points for you to do more work later. So, the key things is that, this is really focused on agents. That's why the data down here is agent-centric. The next one I'm going to show you is going to be more around call center perspective. So I can select my call center overview. The title of the dashboard that I'm in is always displayed on the upper left. It has its own key performance indicators specific to this dashboard, and it's because we're focused on things that are call center related. So I'm looking at, abandoned calls and emergency calls. I'm not really looking at the performance of an individual agent, but I'm looking at this on a weekday for Saturday, and it's essentially all Saturdays. So I can look at that day, and I can say, let me look at every hour and get a breakdown, but that's my call center information, and my chart will actually change as I change my data. So if I was to manipulate the data on the grid, then the chart changes as well. There's no rerun of a report or a refresh button that has to be clicked. It's all dynamic, and it works as you manipulate your data. Looking at just a January 18th, I can filter data. Even though I'm looking at a weekday, I might only want to look at one specific weekday, or I could want to look at all weekdays. And you can change that by either filtering the slicer on the left in the slicer panel, or I could drag it over here and select and hide certain members, and I'll show you kind of how we do that in a little bit as well. The call center overview is really a dashboard for call center metrics. You can use this as a starting point again. None of them are preset or locked down, and we can essentially launch this in the workbench, the exact same dashboard that I have here, and I can start changing it, and I can manipulate it and change from weekday and pull my hour off and say, I really only want to look at this by call category. And then I can save it as a new name. So it wouldn't necessarily be my call center overview. I could just call it call center overview by class of service. And I could be looking at, the number of abandoned calls that occur for certain classes of service. We also have a third pre-built dashboard, which is our daily call center overview. Obviously, like the name says, it's just like the call center overview, but by default, we focus on the previous day. This one's been manipulated only to look at one day, which is kind of what the concept of daily means. But we kind of default to the previous day, and it lets you open up that at any point in time, whatever day you're on, and it defaults to the previous day and shows you how you did, obviously, yesterday. So that's really the only difference between those two. And the same thing, it offers call center metrics. No real difference between the two, except again, it's focused on that day. I can manipulate that. I could take it previous day, and I could pick any day I wanted. I could go back and manipulate it and do it for the entire week. It's just kind of a starting point that lets you launch into something that's already been set up for you. And you'll find out, too, once we get into the workbench area, I think you'll use those 3 pre-built dashboards that we provide, and you'll start saving them off as something, and then you'll really start working on your own library. You'll say, well, I'm going to start with a simple call count dashboard, and it's just got call count for this year or for this month. And that's your starting point because you like to do a lot of call center metric analysis. And that every time you open that up and you work with it, and you manipulate it and you add all these other slicers, then you start to be able to say, I have a workbench, I've created this dashboard, I'm going to now save it into my own private briefing book as XYZ, because it's specific to what you've done. And that way, whenever you're going through your own library, you have a folder for call center views or call center metrics, and it's by year, and I'm adding each one of these of a breakdown of a year on a class of service, or my growth year over year. And once you have this library, you can easily double-click these and it pulls it right up. You don't have to recreate them from scratch. You don't have to pass any more parameters. You don't have to rerun or render. You just double-click it and this data will show up the way you left it, you know. And when I say the way you left it is the way you configured it. It will still pull in the most recent data, but your layout and configuration of your dashboard will already be preset. So in the bottom menu is a dashboard workbench, and when you launch that, immediately see that there is no KPIs because we're not creating or reusing those KPIs from those defaults. We're giving you an area to do your data analysis. And one thing you'll see is that a lot of these options have these pins, and we talked about it, and you can either X and close this panel altogether, or like you would do on any pin, if you click that pin, it's going to go ahead and slide it over here on the left side. I can then hover over it, it'll slide back out to the right, and I can pin it out for display, or I can use my wrench and go ahead and bring it back that way. So it gives you the ability to, if you're not using something, to create more real estate space for you to work in. You could also hover over and you'll get a little slider bar that lets you drag the window and make it larger or smaller as well. So also within this dashboard, it's not just limited to call center metrics. It's not limited to agent performance metrics or trunk and line utilization metrics. It throws all the data out there for you. So you can start looking at data from any perspective and look at any of the calculations that we have and create your own dashboard. There is no limit to what you can do. So for an example here, this is something that you've filtered. We've used a slicer for filter, and this is one that we created. And like I said, once you get into your private book, you'll start creating your own views. And once I've created views, each one of these dashboards I just use. I won't go back to a private briefing book as a starting point because these are my starting points. I might take call growth for an example. Or for this example, I started off with a call perspective by year. And then what I did is I broke it down by month, and I also grouped by weekday, and I took the year part off and put it up in the slicer. And I just renamed it. This is my call perspective by month by weekday for 2016. And I saved it that way. So the work I'm doing, I can save, and I can always go back and look at that. I might have one for 2017 as well and be able to do those for comparison. I might start off again with my call perspective by year and say I'm going to start there and I'm going to have 2 years worth of data. And I'm going to show it in one dashboard. And I'll say call perspective over the last year and a half, over the last 2 years. So you have that readily available for you to do. And then, like I said, if you double-click your call perspective by year, it essentially brings up the dashboard you have, and this one was by year. That's essentially why we named it that way. And this one had a chart on it. The other one I didn't want to show a chart because it was broken down by weekday. But you can hide the chart on some, show the chart on others, show just a chart. Some people are more visually oriented with chart data. Some like to have both. Here's an example of what you can do with the visual indicators. And those visual alerts and exceptions don't always have to be negative. They can be positive, right? If you are trying to strive for a login percentage or an agent efficiency percentage of over 80%, you could highlight that and you can see where certain agents are doing well, and you may want to recognize those agents for doing well. So you can set up these exceptions on positive or negative conditions. The choice is up to you. Again, like I said, you still have your toolbar options where you can show and hide that table or a chart. Same thing, I could change the properties of my chart. One thing, it's nice, sometimes you can show those data labels when you only have a few items that you're displaying on the chart, but like you've seen and I've seen before too, when you get a lot of items that you're charting or graphing, the data labels can be a little cumbersome, hard to read. Another nice thing here is these exceptions I didn't show you, but when you create an exception, like when we looked for calls that weren't answered in less than 10 seconds, and we were looking for 90% of those calls, I can add what we call as a slider, and it essentially lets you slide through the parameters of your exception. So up here, if I've created a slider on my dashboard, you'll have an extra icon, and that icon, when you click it, gives you this little parameters window, and you can then drag your parameter left or right, and it'll on the fly change what visual indicators are present. For example, this one might be showing, everything that is above or below 200. I could easily slide this to the right, and it might show me everything. It might highlight everything that's below 400. And again, the data then would then highlight, you would get those visual exceptions based on a different value without you having to right-click and go in and even edit it. So the nice thing is you might set up a middle of the road saying it's at 300, and when this pops up, it stops right in the middle of 300. But then you could go left or right if you wanted to find out if certain conditions were better or worse depending on a certain day. If I have my afternoon, I might expect to have 300 calls per hour, right? And I expect my call answering time to be a certain value. But in a different time period, I might not need an exception for when it gets to 95%. I might want to know when it gets down to 90% on a slow period. So you pick a slower period of your day, you move that down to 90%, and you start looking for exceptions that were, in that range. But on a busy day, you could change that. So it gives you that flexibility to manipulate these exceptions that you would see on your table without having to go and do any extra edits. You simply click an icon on the toolbar, slide it around, click apply, and you have new data that you can look at. So again, it sometimes gets overwhelming, and so that's why this is kind of just an overview, but the training and the deep dive would really help you see more of all the vast capabilities you have. But even on a grid, I can immediately right-click the grid, and like we talked about, I can right-click it, and I can see hide members, I can show members, I can filter, I can sort. And one of the options on filtering is I can select a filter, and I just want to sort my top 10. So I would pick a top count or a bottom count. I would pick the value that I want, how many I want, and I say OK, and immediately my data sorts by the top 10. Another click, I can say I want to show the crosstab, and I want a chart on top. So I'm going to select the chart above, and I'm also going to right-click and hide none because I don't really care to see none. I only want to see my agents. And again, I'm going to hide none, and within 3 or 4 clicks, I now have my top 10 for calls per hour, and I have a chart that shows that. And that's really kind of how you would manipulate your chart data, simply by right-clicking on the grid data, the chart data, using the menu options, and so forth. So that's kind of an overview of the layout and the workspace that makes up our VESTA Analytics Dashboard module. We've seen charts, grids, KPIs, and we'll cover how these charts and grids can be put into a report as well. It allows you to manipulate that. Kim?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. As you know, how a call center performs and how it complies with service levels is very important metrics to monitor. So can you show us, I'd like to know how I can use a dashboard to create a dashboard showing my level of service. Can you show me how to do that?
Sure. So kind of like what I elaborated before is sometimes we just get a starting point. And, I might take a view that's just my call count dashboard. And it's just got call counts by call category. And it's great. It tells me how many calls I have in my system, whether they're emergency or non-emergency calls. But for level of service, I want to focus on those ranges. So I only want to focus on my emergency calls. So I can immediately, click on the non-emergency and the other. I'm just going to hide those. I could have easily just picked emergency and say I only want to highlight my emergency call. But once those go away, I'm saying, okay, I have all my emergency calls, and I want to, see that data broken down by my answer times. And so we have a call answer duration range that is in our slicers, and I can immediately take that and drag it over to the grid. When I do, it's going to, when I drop it on that grid, it's going to show me the little icon that says, okay, you want to add another dimension. It creates this multi-dimensional view. And it's going to ask me where do I want to put it. So I'm going to nest it after my call category so that I see my emergency calls broken down by each one of these answer ranges. Again, I'll hide the 0, the one that was none, because it really wasn't relevant. So here's all the calls that were answered in those ranges. Obviously, we'd like to see more on the 0 to 10, but you see that there are some that are out into the larger ranges. So what I'm going to do is you can easily pick all of these by highlighting each one of those, and I can create a formula, and I'm just going to sum it up. And when you sum that, you can give it a caption or column header. I'm going to call it total calls. And then from there, I can start determining how I'm doing, right? How many calls, what was the percentage that I answered in less than 10? I know I'm trying to hit 90%. So I can select my total calls, and I can select the 0 to 10 calls, and again, right-click and select a formula, and I just want to find a ratio. And it's going to create a ratio, and I'll call it % less than 10. And you can continue to do this as you build out this level of service. So obviously I want a ratio. I want to find out how many calls were less than 10 seconds. But I also want to know how many calls were less than 20 seconds. Not the ones that were answered in 11 to 20, but all the way from 0 to 20. So what I'll do is I can pick my 0 to 10 and my 11 to 20 together, and I'll create another sum for that. And I'll call it 0 to 20. And you can see I'm creating these calculated measures over here, these formulas, because they got the little FX symbol. And it's adding more columns to my grid that I can use for further calculations like ratios. I can immediately select my total calls on my 0 to 20 and get another ratio of calls that were answered in less than 20 seconds. And you can continue to do this and build this out until you get all these ratios that you want to look at that help you understand your level of service. And when you select these, you'll end up having a bunch of these at the end, and I can then take all of my calculated measures that I don't want visible, like my 0 to 20 count. I really don't want to count those. I just wanted to use them for creating a ratio, and I can hide those, and then I can even take the ones that I now have, which are all my percentages, but I don't want them down at the end because I don't have to scroll across my screen to see them, but I can take them and I can reorder them. And this is really easy to do. You select reorder, you decide to pick one of those and move it on up, and once you get them laid out with the reorder on your grid, you now have a quick dashboard that shows your level of service for the number of calls I answered from 0 to 10, what percentage that was, how much did my percentage go up from 0 to 20, by the time I got to 30 seconds, am I, 100%, how close am I? And you can build this out further, right? You could continue to build it out for each range. You could select each one of the counts after you have all your percentages and hide those. The flexibility is completely up to you. So that's kind of, how quick and easy it is to just drag over your duration ranges, select a few columns, get some counts, get a ratio of one to the other, format it as a percentage, move it around to where it looks the way you like it. And you could say, I could then save this as, level of service. And it'll be my starting point for any level of service analysis I want to do moving forward. So it's pretty easy, a few clicks and there you go.
Okay, well thanks Ron, that looks pretty good. So from this view, it looks like we answered most of our calls within 10 seconds, is that right?
Well, yeah, that's what it would, it would look like that, right? It says 96% of your calls. But again, remember, this is at kind of a high level, right? This is all my calls. So, you might think everything's looking pretty good, but here's where you're going to want to start looking at more detail. You're going to want to dive down into this. So if I was to take this same dashboard that we started with and I add the year, like we talked about, right? I can drag that year over and start looking at how I did each year. And I like to put a subtotal in too because I can right-click on there, add a subtotal, and it immediately adds one across the top. Because when we were looking before, that 96.22, it's like, oh yeah, okay, we're doing okay, But if I have a couple hundreds, that means I have some that are below. And again, nothing pops out at me right now because I don't have any visual indicators that say there's a problem. But like I said, if we go back and we do that exception, I can create the exception and create some different colors and a different font for problem areas, right? This one would be less than 60. So I'm going to go ahead and create a bunch just so I can see how bad it gets, right? Is everything, in the 90% range, maybe 80 to 90? I really want to know if it gets below 80 and really if it gets below 60. So I'll create these exceptions, and then once I apply these exceptions, it's a lot easier now to see that, okay, 2016 we had, seemed to be this year, or the year that we're looking at, where we started having problems answering calls, at least what we were trying to comply with. And it might just have been a bad month. It could have been a bad day. So what we'll do is you can eventually start expanding this down, and as I go through my hierarchical calendar dimension, I can see I'm breaking it down by quarter, and I break it down by month, and I'm like, oh, okay, January wasn't so good. And maybe I want to look at January, and I can do the same thing. I can expand across by clicking this range, and it shows you how many calls were answered at 0 seconds, 1 second, 2, and I was thinking, well, maybe they're all up around 10 seconds, but it's not the case. That looks pretty even distribution. But still, I have 78% in January, and that just doesn't sit well with me. So I can eventually expand that by day of the year and look exactly what day might have been problematic. And because I created these different exceptions, you can see like here under the 0 to 20, we started having a couple days get back into the 90s. But, the 25th and 26th look to be like my really problematic days. And I'm not quite sure why yet, and I might want to find out if that was, strictly wireless or wireline calls. I could do the analysis that way. But I might want to find out if there were just certain agents that just couldn't answer those calls or were struggling to answer those calls. So I want to focus on January 25th. So what I'll do is I can take that 25th and drag it back over to my slicer panel, and it shows in bold that I'm looking at only data for January 25th. And then I'm going to grab my initial agents that were answering those calls and drag those back over and nest them afterwards. And I see, okay, well, now I have all my agents, and I can look at how they're performing in those ranges. But there's a lot of agents, and maybe I don't want to look at everybody. Maybe I only need to talk to 3 or 4. Let me start by looking at the worst, 3 or 4. So I can immediately take that column and I want to sort it. So I'll sort by the worst performers, and then I'm only going to grab a few. I don't know. I don't want the 7882 console that was logged in. Might have been a phone, but I want to get the agents of their console. So I'll select a few of those, and I'll only want to see the highlighted members. And now I can immediately look and say, okay, here's the highlighted members. Here's how they performed. A couple of them started doing better, getting some calls in the 30 seconds, but obviously, Ms. King and Ms. Bruno, we probably are going to want to go look on the 25th for calls that those agents might have taken and find out what might have been going on at that time that kind of indicates why we had a call answer time below what we expect. So it's easy to say, well, yeah, it looks pretty good at the high level, but sometimes you want to find out if that's really the case. And when you start drilling down and dragging and dropping a different perspective and then sorting and putting some colors to it, it's really easy to start having your eyes focus on something. And that's one of the nice advantages is that I can take here just in a few minutes and show you that there were probably a few agents in January that kind of contributed, or a few days in January for that matter, that contributed to some of our answer time deficiencies. And then you can immediately go back into the event list in VESTA Analytics, select the calls for that agent or those 2 agents on the 25th, and get a short list of their 40 calls and start seeing, well, what happened, on maybe it's the ones you want to focus down here. Why did you answer 10 calls greater than 61 seconds? What happened? And you can then see the detail of the call. Was it a ringing? Was it in queue? What happened, before you answered that call, and what can we do to maybe improve that moving forward? So that's kind of how I think you can get back into the details and drive down into the deeper part of your data to find out where you might want to look at it.
Okay, thanks, Ron. That was great. Now I can see easily how to find the issues that may be hiding in my plain sight. So another item that I wanted to say that was important for call centers is the ability to show growth in call volume. So can you help me justify the request for more staffing? Show me how this can be done in the dashboard.
Yeah, so we'll start off and we'll go back to that basic call count dashboard. And again, I'm looking at my calls, but obviously I want to look at my calls over a period of time. So I'm going to see if those number of calls are growing and how fast they're growing, and if I'm anticipating continued growth, then I might want to say, I think we're going to need maybe to request some funding for some more agents. And the growth is just one factor, right? You might be able to handle a certain amount of growth, and you would look at your average answer time with this growth and say, oh, well, my average answer time is still low. I'm not really worried about it. But if I'm having a nominal amount of growth and it's harder to hit those answer times, or we're getting more abandoned calls, then you might have a little more leverage to say, some additional staffing has proved in the past that, we're meeting our requirements. But we'll start off with just the same thing, the simple call count that I saved as call count, so it's really easy to start here again. I'm only going to focus on my emergency calls, and I'm going to, move my call count over to my slicers because I only want to see the years. And like we said, we can easily, because it's hierarchical, I can expand and look at the quarters. So before I get into days, sometimes seeing call growth between days doesn't really do much for me. So I'm going to stay at the quarter level, and I'm going to pick quarter 3 and quarter 4. So I'm going to pick those two, and I can right-click, say formula, do math. And the nice thing is it's pre-built. You don't even have to figure out what the formula for growth is, where you're adding those two and dividing by those smaller ones. But you just pick growth, and it will add a growth formula for you. And that growth formula then pops up on that list. I'm going to call it the quarter 4 growth, 2014 quarter 4 growth, and it shows up right there in your quarter 4. I could have done it for quarter 2 and quarter 3 and found the growth there. But for this example, we'll do it for each one of these quarters. We just want to look back at, the last 8 quarters. So once you create all of those, that's great. Now I have percentages of growth. But that's all I want to look at right now. I don't care about the numbers anymore. So I'm going to select all of my growth formulas that I created, and I just want to select them and I want to highlight those. That's all I want to see. So then everything else gets hidden. It only shows me my growth. I'm going to then throw a chart on there, and I'm also going to add another exception for negative growth. Anything that's negative in my cross-tabular data I want to see is red. It just helps me visualize it. I could have picked everything that's positive as green, but it's up to you. So I picked anything that has less than 0% growth to be negative, and I want that bold and red. So now I immediately, within half a dozen clicks, have a dashboard that shows growth over the past couple of years, where we were increasing in growth, then we dropped a little, we had a brief increase, and then we've had a significant decline in the last quarter. So, if you're looking to try to justify the need for more call takers, I don't know if this is really going to do it. But at least it tells you some of the trends that you've had over the years and where you're currently at now. And that growth you may have anticipated, right? There could have been a number of reasons why the number of calls coming into your center are less than they were the previous quarter. So that's kind of real quick how you can create that growth. Now, I might need to send this to somebody, right? Because obviously you're asking it from me because somebody's asking it of you and they're going to want to report on it. So I can easily take this dashboard that I have, and like I said, there was a little report mode icon up here on the toolbar that lets me take the dashboard I'm in, and it immediately flips it over into a report environment. Now, this is the exact same data. I could still right-click on this table and hide it. I could flip my chart. I could decide not to include the chart. I can widen my columns. I can change the font of my columns, the colors, and I could get it just looking the way I want. I could even add a note on this saying this analysis was done on today per request of such and such, blah, blah, blah. You can add all that, and when you're done with it, you can immediately come up here, click on the Save button, and I'm going to save it to a PDF. And essentially what you get at the end of the day is a PDF file that you can email or save or send off or whatever you need to do with it. So, within a few minutes, you can create a new dashboard, find out what your growth is, create a report for it, and send it out to somebody who's been requesting it for you. Simple as that, ABC.
again, thanks, Ron. You're right. They look pretty simple. So lastly, as we wrap up this webinar, I just wanted to go over some key takeaways for our last webinar of the year that we've done. I want to show that VESTA Analytics offers a full range of features available, as I mentioned earlier, for different data consumers, from static to pre-built reports for quick reporting. Another key takeaway from this webinar is how you can look at Agent Performance Dashboard to show metric information specific to how agents are performing. And then lastly, we did provide you ways to see how to easily find issues that might be hiding in plain sight with using the level of service dashboard and then drilling into the data. So to sum up, we've shown you the ability to analyze vast amounts of data from different perspectives and set thresholds that will help you find key areas within your operation that may need further review. We've shown you how to build custom pages for key performance indicators and activity thresholds that you can set for your sites. And lastly, we've shown you how to create a library for specific metrics and visual indicators that you can reference and adjust your operations change. This will ensure that you are in compliance and running as effectively as possible. It also provides some insights into future staffing and planning needs. So now before I hand it back over to Flynn for any final questions and answers, I just again wanted to thank everyone for your attendance today. And if you have any questions, again, if this is something you're interested in, this dashboard module, please reach out to your Airbus Regional Area Sales Manager, and we will be happy to assist you. Back over to you, Flynn.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Ron. So we had a couple of questions come in, Kim and Ron. One is, you have to be in a particular version of analytics for the dashboard module.
Yeah, I think correct me if I'm wrong, Kim, I think our dashboard module is probably available in VESTA Analytics really 2.4 and above. I think that's where we really started making some enhancements. So as long as you're at VESTA Analytics 2.4 and above, you should have the full features we've described.
Okay.
That is correct. That is correct, Ron.
And Ron, you touched on this, but I think it'd be good just to go over it again. The question is, if I don't see the dashboard on my analytics homepage, does that mean my organization hasn't paid for that license?
It can mean one of two things. If you're running VESTA Analytics Lite, our Lite edition for smaller call centers, the dashboard is not supported in that edition. But in some of the more feature-rich editions, like the Standard Edition, Hosted, or Enterprise, you may not see that. And if you don't in those editions, then it's the fact that there's no license, so the license wasn't purchased, and essentially it wasn't installed during setup time. Now, it could be purchased after the fact, and that license can be added to the analytics system, and the menu would then become visible.
Okay. Other questions? Going through those examples was great. That really helps you see the power when you go through the scenarios and how you put it all together. Really, really good. So over to you on our session today. Any other questions from our audience? Those were the two I saw come in. I want to make sure I didn't miss any. Ron, will you go back one slide? I want to just remind everyone that from our homepage, that's a picture of our homepage, in that first box, when you click on that box, you'll get the information about the whole series, what we did in each of the sessions, and the recordings. And we'll be posting the recording from today's session here a little bit later this afternoon. But you have access to all of them right now, right there. And there's also, you can always email Wanda and me with any questions. That's VESTA Marketing, and you'll see that at airbusdscom.com, and you'll see that on that page. And we'll get right back to you. So I want to say thank you for joining us. You've been a great group. So fun to do these webinars, and thank you all for joining us. Again, don't hesitate to contact us for any other questions. Ron and Kim, much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.